Japan program. We are co-sponsoring this talk tonight with the Consulate General of Japan in Boston. And in that regard, I'd like to mention, he's already standing up, Mr. Shigeru Toyama from the consulate. And Mr. I thank you very much for all your help in organizing the lecture. We're really very pleased to have tonight with us Mr. Masumi Muramatsu, who has just finished a book on humor in communications. This is actually his third book on humor. He wrote a book in 1978 called I Couldn't Speak English Either. And its sequel in 1979 was called The Joy of English, How Humor Helps Communications. Both of these books, all three of these books have been published by Simul Press, which is a company that he founded. I'll go back a little bit. He started his English-speaking career working with the Allied occupation forces in Japan in 1949. I'm not sure if it's the best way to learn English. I think he took a step upward when after that he studied English literature at Waseda University. His simultaneous interpreting career started in the mid-50s when he worked for the Japan Productivity Center / U.S. State Department program. And in the next 4.5 years, he made 30 6-week trips on their behalf. In 1960, he joined the U.S.-Japan Trade Council, which is the predecessor of today's Japan Economic Institute of America, first as a research assistant and later as the research director. He studied at that time at George Washington University. He's acted as an interpreter for numerous important international conferences in the political, economic, and cultural as well as technical arenas. And these include the first 9 summit meetings of the heads of state and government of the 7 industrialized countries. I should say something about Simul International. It's quite well known in Japan. And the Simul provides a professional organization, it is a professional organization which provides services in interpreting and translation, conference organization, convention management, interpreter and translation training in English, Chinese, and Japanese, and international training for businessmen and women. And it is also a publishing company, as I mentioned, and Mr. Muramatsu has brought copies of his book in Japanese. If any of you would like to purchase a copy at the end of the talk, how much are they? This is our little.
I don't think I have copies to sell, actually.
To sell. All right.
One to show.
One to show. Okay.
Show off.
You can certainly order them through Sasuke Bookstore, I'm sure. Mr. Muramatsu.
Thank you, Shao-san. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm glad to meet you folks and appreciate the very generous introduction and publicity about my book. I'm modesty befitting Japanese should prevent me from talking any more about this, but I can't resist the temptation. This is the book, 指導者たちのユーモア or Humor in Leadership, in which I do some name dropping to attract the reader's attention or potential buyer's attention. These are basically anecdotes, episodes pertaining to or jokes told by some of the best-known people in the world. To drop a few names, American presidents, the last one is Mr. George Bush, goes back to President John F. Kennedy. In fact, Senator John F. Kennedy back in '56, whom I interpreted. And Mr. Reagan was my favorite. Japanese prime ministers going back to Tanaka, the controversial yet charismatic leader, and the first summit Mr. Nakasone attended, and my favorite prime minister in between was Mr. Ohira. I might tell you something of his humor. Throw in for variety, like Prince Charles, Lady Diana, Lee Iacocca, Jeffrey Archer, if that's not enough, Yasser Arafat. Now, if you allow me to sit down, I wasn't going to tell you this, but this reminds me of my favorite anecdote of one of the two people named in this book whom I personally did not meet. But that one is Queen Elizabeth II. The other is Kirk Douglas. I have his episode in my book, but I never met him. I'd love to meet him. About 5-6 years ago, Queen Elizabeth was visiting this country. At that time, she said, last time I came here was to celebrate your bicentennial with a gallant disregard of history. I thought that was a charming way to put it. And Americans assembled on the White House lawn really appreciate that humor, regal humor, I should say. When President George Bush introduced the Queen and stepped down, somebody had forgotten to put the elevator or the stage for the Queen. The result was the Queen was hidden behind what was called the forest of microphones, and the photographers could not see her. They only saw her broad-brimmed, elegant hat hopping up and down. Talking hat, the press reported, and she was not amused. Next day, however, when she addressed the joint session of the US Congress, the elevator had been properly placed. And her first words, I saw the whole thing on television, I have it on record, she said, I hope you can all see me from where you are. That was all forgiving gesture. I thought that was lovely. The international comparison of sense of humor interests me. An old joke, still in currency, still good, goes like this. When joke is only half told, a Frenchman or Frenchwoman, as far as that is concerned, would laugh in the middle of a joke. The Englishman would wait until the end of the joke to laugh. Many say they have to wait. The German would philosophize over it all night and laugh next morning. Pardon me if they're German, but I'll be dealing with the Japanese in even-handed manner. The American smiles and tells you it's an old joke. And besides, you don't tell it quite well. The Japanese is full of a smile without understanding it. This is funny because it's to a great extent true. I supply my own punchline. The Japanese would smile in the interest of harmony, right? But go back to our office or organization, have a conference and decide whether to laugh or not, and come back to you next morning. Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, was visiting Japan about 10 years ago. At that time, still amicably with Lady Diana. They're both charming people. And he addressed the Japanese Diet, the equivalent of your Congress. And it was my honor to provide interpreting. That was not so-called simultaneous interpreting. It was consecutive interpreting. The prince would speak for a minute or 2, 3 minutes. Then I would reproduce the passage into Japanese for all the assembled members of a legislature to hear, and for, in fact, millions of Japanese to hear over the television, nationwide, NHK. It was an important state occasion. And I was privileged that the British embassy would ask me to do it. The speech was prepared and was carefully and rather well translated beforehand by the British embassy press people to be distributed to the media for reporting. However, the actual delivery may not be exactly the same as written. This is always the case. In our trade, we have the warning, check against delivery. The text may be given, but it may not be read as it's written. And interpreter should never be caught translating what's written but what has not been said. Diplomats, sorry to say this, Mr. Toyama, play a very interesting game of preparing written text, handing it out for the press to read, but when it comes to the actual delivery, you leave out some of the harsh statements critical of the other party, right? But serves the purpose. But for the record, you didn't say it. It's very interesting. By the way, this lady in the front corner is Miss Thelma Bettel, retired U.S. diplomat. She was in Japan. She came to Japan in 1947. And sorry about mentioning this, but we're all friends. I met her in 1949 when I was 19. And that was when I had my first job with occupation as clerk typist. And my boss, the big-hearted woman who had sense of humor and warm heart to hire me, a poor boy who obviously needed a job, who couldn't speak English, but typed pretty fast. She hired me, thinking that she could provide me rice for 3 months probationary period. But later, I became an interpreter. She was very pleased with my progress. And Thelma Bettel was a very close friend. That's how we met. We have maintained a friendship ever since then. Yesterday I was visiting with her family. In fact, grandchildren. So that's dating myself. But let's get back to fast forward to Prince Charles' address at the Japanese Diet. This speech was well prepared, but a couple of places he altered, but then it would be my job to change it accordingly. But British embassy people are sophisticated clients. They know how to effectively employ interpreters. They said, Mr. Muramatsu, this is the text, this is the translation we prepared. This is what we distribute. But for the oral delivery, I'll leave it completely up to you. You know it, the job. In other words, I change it a little bit for the most effective oral delivery. And what's the distinction? Oral comprehension, most impressive, warm, humorous speech, which it was. At one place, Prince Charles, referring to the growing exchange of people, visits between Britain and Japan, said that British people were pleased that Prince Naruhito, he mangled the pronunciation a little bit, but he meant the then the present Crown Prince, Naruhito, chose Oxford to further his education. However, changing his tone slightly, and interpreters catch that tone. Had my view been asked, I would have probably recommended Cambridge. Now, that's like MIT, Harvard, whatever. Like Keio Waseda, right? That's meant to be a joke. Obviously, he was not criticizing the choice of the Japanese imperial household in sending the young prince to Oxford instead of his school, Cambridge. In interpreting that passage into Japanese, I carefully changed my tone to alert or to warn the Japanese audience, Diet members, that, mind you, this is going to be a joke. And in Japanese, I said, もし私の意見が求められていたら、私の母校、ケンブリッジをお勧めしたでしょう。Notice I inserted the word 私の母校, my alma mater, which was not in the original English. For the English-speaking people, it was quite obvious that it was a light-hearted joke capitalized on this well-known rivalry between Cambridge and Oxford. But this may not be quite so obvious to all the Japanese people listening, Diet members and TV watchers. So I added my alma mater, my school, to make sure that everybody would understand the point of humor. And I was quite successful. And it brought the house down. In fact, both upper and lower house down, I should say. I can't resist that wordplay. And for that, British ambassador thanked me. In fact, Prince Charles stopped on his way out, shake my hands, and had been kind of alerted that the prince might do that. And I had practiced my response. Stood at attention, shook his hand, bowed, and said, "It's my great honor, Your Highness." Came out beautifully. But I didn't know Lady Diana was doing the same. She stopped, stooped, shook my hands. I was speechless. I meant to say at least, "Thank you very much, ma'am," but I was so excited that my voice didn't come out. And it was seen by literally millions of people on television, NHK. My face wrinkled up like this, shaking her hand, but no voice was coming out. President Reagan has been my favorite client. I'm sorry that he is walking toward the sunset, but I suppose that's the style he would go. And I think he is a man of great sense of humor. I interpreted for him many times, going back to the days when he was governor of California, and many times in the White House in his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 summit meetings. Mrs. Thatcher was one person who attended more summit meetings, I think like 10 summits, than 9 summits I interpreted for. President Reagan, at the Williamsburg summit, which was Prime Minister Nakasone's first, was giving his press conference at the end of the first day. He was the spokesperson for all heads of state and government. At the end of the second day, all the 7 people would speak to the press. But at the end of the first day was sort of an interim press conference. Mr. Reagan was going to tell the whole world through the assembled reporters what transpired on the first day of the G7 summit. Just about when he was going to speak up, there was a sharp noise, bang, as if somebody shot a pistol. No, that wasn't long after the incident in which Mr. Brady was seriously wounded, which all froze. Mr. Reagan quickly surveyed the situation and said, "Missed me." The bullet missed me. It was great. That was, the way he told it, so calm and so disarming. You remember when he was seriously injured in front of the White House. He was rushed to the, I think that was the Bethesda Naval Hospital. When he first saw Mrs. Nancy Reagan, he said to her, "Honey, I forgot to duck." To lower his head. Remember he was an actor, movie actor. So that was a lousy act. And when the surgeons were about to operate on him, no, before that, looking at a team of nurses, obviously nice looking, he said to have whispered, "Does Nancy know this?" And to the doctors, he said, "I hope you are all Republicans." And the chief surgeon replied, "Mr. President, today we are all Republicans." No, I wasn't there to interpret for this, but I think it's a wonderful story. Half of these presidential jokes are actually made up by his advisors and fed to the press to assure the nation that the president is okay. But these are all great stories. Now, humor need not be jokes. That is one point I like to emphasize. In fact, jokes, wrong jokes, jokes in poor taste, politically incorrect jokes are in very, very bad taste. But by contrast, something about your own weakness, a little silly mistake you've made, the shortcomings of your profession or your national group, ethnic group, as long as it's about yourself, and offer yourself as the butt of the joke. That makes everybody more comfortable. In fact, when I went around several countries, like Frenchman laughing at the middle of your joke, Englishman having to wait until the end of your joke, I sound like making mockery of these different nationalities. But then, remember, I ended with making fun of myself, Japanese. Then I think you're forgiven. There are many people who are good at this kind of self-deprecating humor. Self-deprecating humor is my favorite category of jokes. Many people ask me, seriously and jokingly, is there such thing as Japanese humor? Or Japanese humor is a contradiction in terms, or oxymoron, to use the big Greek word, on the order of, some say, military intelligence or athletic scholarship. I don't mean to make fun of you athletic scholars, but many people think there's no such thing as Japanese humor. I like to argue otherwise. We seem humorless because we don't employ humor for communication, particularly public communication. Typically in your country, a public speaker is expected to break the ice with a joke or light anecdote to make the audience feel at ease. Not in Japan. Nobody does that. So far, I'm trying to encourage Japanese people to do that. A few Japanese are beginning to do this. So next time when Japanese come and speak, don't be shocked if he or she starts with a joke. I'd like to share with you a couple of examples of Japanese public figures who have employed humor effectively with some design or with some tutoring from their advisors. Prime Minister Suzuki, who remembers him? Poor Mr. Suzuki has been more or less forgotten. Suzuki, Zenko Suzuki, only for a year and a half or so. For his first visit to this country, he came to New York and addressed the big Japan Society organized dinner. And I was interpreting his Japanese into English. in the temporary set up glass booth, simultaneous interpreting booth for acoustical purpose. He began saying, 私は学生時代, and as I was interpreting that into English, when I was in college, I was better than any other students in all subjects. Now, that doesn't sound like a Japanese speaker, right? Japanese is supposed to be modest. It's for me, I'm a lousy scholar, I apologize, I'm sorry, I don't think I can really fill up with comments, etc. But then he said, I was better scholar than anybody else, but he added, except in English. That is why, and he went on to say, I brought, and there he said, Japan's best interpreter. And with some stupidity, I had to repeat that. Because when he says that, he's not saying that merely to flatter me. And I should not edit that out. Even when the speaker says, that is the lousiest interpreter I have ever heard, I would still interpret that. And I would do it so well that the audience would pass the correct judgment anyway. I can get even with nasty people. And that timing, I was a better student than anyone else except in English. With the way it was delivered, had mild shock effect upon the audience who hadn't expected anything like this very mild joke from a Japanese prime minister and from a politician they had, forgive me, never heard of, Mr. Suzuki. But he was somewhat like President Gerald Ford. Mr. Ford himself, whom I enjoyed interpreting for many times, was not a great storyteller, but he was armed with a battery of advisors, humor consultants. And he was open-minded enough to listen to his advisors and read the jokes they write every now and then. And that was quite good, actually. Mr. Suzuki would listen to his advisors. The late Mr. Ohira, Prime Minister, who attended only one summit just before his second, he collapsed, died in the middle of an election campaign, was a man of really disarming humor. I was accompanying him on his last overseas trip to Washington, D.C. for a summit meeting. And then he went to Mexico, and because I'm not Spanish interpreter, I was excused. I enjoyed my few days of busman's holiday in Washington and New York before joining the party in Ottawa. From Ottawa, he went to Vancouver, where he made his last speech. He suddenly had to fly to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, to attend President or Marshal Tito's state funeral. Prime Minister Ohira was reading his carefully prepared and rehearsed speech in English. He does read English very well. The Canadian press, in a very friendly manner, reported the event as reading his speech in labored but articulate English. I think it's being put very fairly and kindly. Labored but articulate. That's the thing. Everybody understands him. Mr. Ohira was saying, gives me a pleasure to announce on behalf of the Japanese government to contribute, did he use the word grant? $500,000 to the University of British Columbia, and the text said, for its Japanese studies. But he was reading so articulate that when he paused for half a second, To the University of British Columbia, everybody applauded. It would have been a little awkward for him to add for its Japanese studies after the commotion had subsided. He was embarrassed. He grinned and scratched his head and added, "Of course it's for Japanese studies." And those two words, "of course," made up completely for that little slip. It was self-effacing or self-deprecating. He was honest about his little error in reading the text, and people would understand that the donation of $500,000 must have had a conditional string attached to it. But it was a charming way to make up for that little error. I love his sense of humor. Prime Minister, few years later, was Mr. Miyazawa, who is well known for his command of English and knowledge of Western literature and tradition. Once he impressed his international audience, including many Europeans, tremendously, when he was speaking for public consumption. There were press people present, and therefore I feel free to quote this story. He was referring to certain action by the government, Bank of Japan, rather, to either raise or lower the official discount rate. Whether it went up or down didn't interest me. I don't take interest in substance. I only remember the jokes or episodes. He was emphasizing that this was a very timely action on the Bank of Japan to the American and the European audience. And he was speaking in English. I was merely listening. And he said, after emphasizing this was timely, he said rather nonchalantly, "There is a tide in the affairs of men." Did somebody say that? And went on. When a lot of people in the audience were obviously moved, and I heard many people look at each other and almost gasp. Did you hear that? Because as many of you may realize, it was a quote from Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Act 3. But if Mr. Miyazawa has said that, Julius Caesar, Act 3, it would have been snobbish, wouldn't have been good taste. But he merely quoted it. There's a tide in the affairs of men. Forgive him, he was very chauvinist. But there's a tide in the affairs of men. In other words, if something like, if you catch the tide, your fortune rises. If you miss it, etc. To me, it sounded like Shakespeare. Immediately that night, I checked it. Sure, that was Shakespeare. But those assembled European scholars and statesmen and women, they were really impressed. I thought that was great for a Japanese political figure to quote Shakespeare without making it so obvious. Not many people can do it. Around the same time, a well-known Japanese business leader, at that time he was already chairman of a major trading firm, was giving an address, in fact, at your institution, MIT. And he had known me professionally for many years. He rang me up and said, "村松-san, I need your advice." I gave the outline of my talk, and my very able American speechwriter wrote this beautiful speech. I like it. But in one place, he quotes Shakespeare. And I'm not comfortable to read it aloud because I don't know it. It was like the subject of that lecture here. You can maybe check your archive, might be recorded somewhere, on the Japanese so-called industrial policy. Those were the days when many people suspected that there was an organized collusion between the government, i.e. MITI, and the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and Japanese industry as a whole, to work together on this so-called industrial policy. And this gentleman's whole point was no such thing. In other words, it isn't big thing. It isn't big deal. We private business people run our business pretty much the way we want to. You can argue otherwise. But his American speechwriter inserted a phrase that went like, to quote Macbeth, methinks the lady doth protest too much, or something. In other words, you're making too much fuss of this. No big deal. There isn't big industrial policy. So he was uncomfortable because he had never heard that before. And he was right. Naturally, he would not be comfortable. So he called me up and said, Muramatsu-san, help me. All right, give me an hour or so. So I came up with my suggestion. I suggested, since this was over 10 years ago, and he's completely retired, and he will remain unidentified, I think I can share this with you. I suggested that he add, after reading this Shakespearean quote, to say in somewhat apologetic, traditional Japanese manner, as I must confess that this part was written by my capable American speechwriter. But being Japanese, I would feel more comfortable quoting from the Analects of Confucius, or Rongo, or Koshi no Kotoba. And the audience was warm, amused. They liked his unaffected, unpretentious admission that this Shakespeare wasn't really his. And for the very end of his speech, to emphasize his point, he did quote Confucian saying. That is what I suggested to him. Please choose your favorite phrase from the Analects of Confucius or Rongo to suit the purpose. There, he would be much better than I. So that was how he did it. And when he came back, he told me it was a great success. He bought me dinner. I like it. Now, this place being none other than MIT, and I was inquiring Ms. Sherwood about my favorite economist, client of mine, Professor Paul Samuelson, Nobel laureate in economics. I hope to have a chance to pay him a courtesy call. I interpreted for his public lectures at least 4 times in my recollection. The first was in 1971, long time ago. And whenever I interpret for anyone who has written a book, I buy a copy of that book and make an effort to at least read the table of contents, the blurb on the jacket, and thumb through the index to see what the book is about. So in 71, I read the 8th edition of Paul Samuelson's famous economics textbook. Of course, I didn't read all. I couldn't. That would be beyond my capability. But with some economic background, reading that thing helps me to interpret Professor Samuelson's public lecture reasonably well. In fact, he liked it. And after the lecture, I tentatively asked for his autograph. I always ask for the speaker's autographs after interpreting. They usually write some compliments. Before, anything could be very impersonal. And there, I never forget what he wrote. I still have these books. For Masumi Muramatsu, he said, who improves my prose and clarifies my thought. Now. Isn't that beautiful? And very humorous. And I didn't improve his prose. No. I merely changed it to Japanese. But this was his way of thanking me for doing it. It clarifies my thought. My goodness, I could not clarify the thought of a Nobel laureate, would be Nobel laureate. But then, several years later, I interpreted for him again, and that time I had bought the 11th edition of his textbook. You see, I'm good at these things. One, I'm loyal to my client. And after interpreting, I asked for his autograph. Actually, when he autographed for the first time, he quipped. I asked, may I ask for your autograph? He quipped, sure, because this means excellent royalties for me. Royalties. Now, isn't that nice? Not many people do that, say that. And second time, he inscribed the book to Masumi Muramatsu, who improves on perfection. That is a double-edged humor. Who improves on perfection. In other words, I think he's saying, I'm perfect, but you improve on my perfect speech. I like that kind of humor. The third time, that was after he retired. He became Professor Emeritus MIT. And he was visiting professor at NYU, where I interpreted for his lecture. And earlier, I played tennis with him a couple of times. I helped organize games in Japan. And this time, the 12th edition, he wrote to Masumi Muramatsu, worthy opponent and partner on the tennis court. Didn't mention anything about my interpreting. I think he was beginning to take my interpreting for granted, but I was glad that he remembered that he enjoyed playing tennis with me. Quickly coming to the final part of my chatting with you. For cross-cultural communication, we should and we can always look for the kind of humor that can transcend cultural and linguistic barriers. And there are plenty of stories, anecdotes, in fact, jokes that can be shared universally. Avoid puns or word plays, P-U-N-S, puns or word plays, or dajale, particularly bad puns. You know what's the definition of bad pun? That's a pun that you didn't think of first. When somebody else comes up with a clever pun, you say, that's a bad pun. If you think of it, it's a very clever pun. Idioms requiring background, cultural understanding, or knowledge of history had better be avoided. If you were chatting over supper or dinner, if you had time, you might like to explain that when President Truman had on his desk the sign that says, the buck stops here. If you explain a little bit of the background, that would amuse your guests or your friends from other countries. But for anyone who has never heard of it, the buck stops here doesn't mean a darn thing. You might as well just leave it out. But then if time permits, if the circumstances allow it, do quote some of your historical anecdotes, interesting stories. We have a lot of interesting stories in Japan. Prime Minister Ohira was good at these anecdotes. When he was asked by an overseas press corps, how come the Japanese Prime Minister cannot stop the growing surpluses in Japan's current account and trade? Can't you do something to stop? Mr. Ohira, again scratching his head, said, eh. And he was famous for ahs and oohs. But in between ahs and oohs, he was the most articulate and learned speaker anyone has ever seen. You can look at transcript records. He said, これは鴨川の流れと叡山の総平のようなものでございまして、all the Japanese understand this reference. This is unfairly antiquated to young people. But I translate that quickly, adding minimum footnotes for the overseas press, that this is like reversing the flow of river Kamo that runs through Kyoto, and calming down the warlike Buddhist priests of Mount Hiei outside of Kyoto. In the medieval days, certain emperor lamented that, alas, I can't control these monks, and I can't reverse the flow of River Kamo. That emperor was finally exiled, self-exiled. And reference was clear to the middle-aged or older Japanese. But then for the international audience, I had to add a few words here and there, minimum technical footnotes. And I reasonably successfully amused the foreign press. They reported, he said something exotic about this thing being totally beyond the control of the Prime Minister. The Australians are my favorite lot. They have their own funny idioms and phrases. One Austrian Prime Minister over a decade ago I wasn't there, reported to have told his counterpart, Japanese Prime Minister, something in thickly Australian idiom, colloquial idiom, emphasizing that, trust us, we will deal everything in fair manner with you. What he said was translated into Japanese not by one of us, by an Australian interpreter, I think, which in Japanese translated backward into Japanese. It's always dangerous to translate